All right, we're here once again with Leo Rappaport from Chicago. We're going to chat and schmooze a bit about a couple of yanim that looking into the last couple of days in no particular order. One thing I was looking into the other day, those that follow me on WhatsApp, I saw that I posted a bit about it on the status, on the chat. If you're not already following the status on the chat, get in touch with me. Is the Olam kocht sich right now in the issue of permanent daylight savings time. Right, so we can get just a bit into the current events and a bit of the history. We know that currently there's a push in Washington coming from the president for some reason. I don't know we need a deeper political explanation. What's the theory? What's the hezbollah? Why the president is pushing for this so much? I don't know. I don't have a theory about that. And the ikr, what political theory is it? Conservatism? Is it example? We'll leave that to the other talk shows. But he's pushing for permanent daylight savings time, which means that even in the winter, even in TIFF in December, January, there will be daylight savings time, which means that everything is off by an hour. And as many people know, that means that in the winter, even in New York, and certainly the more north you go, I believe.
The more north you go and the more west within each time zone. So places like Detroit, which are at the far west of the Eastern time zone, already are challenging with Zmanim in January and December. So.
Right. So you have the list of Zmanim. People were sending around mock-ups of the list of potential Zmanim. I don't remember exact numbers, but I think nets would be after 8 o'clock, right? That's the ikr.
I think they said that in South Bend, Indiana, which is actually not far from where we are, from Chicago, there would be 2 months a year where nets would be after 9 o'clock.
Really? Wow. Okay. So depending on where you are, it could be even worse. But for New York, the way it's described is nets would be 8:15. In terms of children going to school would be still in the dark because until nets, it's not fully light. Of course, it's cute. You learn Mesechus Brachos. You learn about if you actually learn about the Zmanim and you understand the Zmanim, you have a sort of a leg up on the rest of the population. The rest of the population doesn't give as much thought to inyanim like first daylight and sunrise, etc. Unless they're into astronomy. But we're a bit ahead of the game on this topic of klal. But of course, it's negeh specifically to davening. And we know the people that go to work, and some people need to be on the way to work before 8. So if nets is at 8:15, so that creates a real problem for people with davening. And now, of course, there are people that have a problem with davening, depending on where they live and depending on when they start work and when they have to start commuting to work. There could be a problem even without permanent daylight savings time in the winter. And I guess in those cases they ask a Rav or whatever they do. But
I think that's a major part of the discussion here is that. Besides the challenge, there's the challenge of change, meaning communities like Detroit have already gotten used to, for example, many people daven b'kvius before nets in the winter, and that's just become the norm in places like Detroit. Now, obviously, it's going to further complicate things for them because it's now even an hour later than that. But even in places like New York and Chicago, so it's a matter of is there going to be a change now in which the norm in Chicago and New York will be like the norm is now in Detroit. So, and that's a question that's happened a number of times over the years with the various. I mean, you were referring to the time changes in the 70s in the United States, and I believe there were similar time changes in Europe also in the 70s and also. Pre-World War II, I think there was also another set of time changes with the West, Belgium, France, and those countries moving into the European time zone. So it'd be interesting to see. This is a new problem for us, but it's not really new.
Right. So due to this ongoing, this renewed discussion that really burst out into the open again this week. I mean, there were rumblings about it for the last couple of months, last couple of years. I think maybe even the president's first term, I think there was talk about it, maybe which is when I first started digging into the parsha from the 70s. But now this week, Congress actually passed its part of the law. We're just waiting to see what happens in the Senate. There may be a lot more pushback and delay in the Senate. It might not happen. I haven't been checking religiously every couple of minutes to see what the latest updates are. So I don't even know what the chances, what the odds of it passing are. It's hard to tell, but there is some momentum, definitely some momentum now behind this law. So that's why everyone's talking about this again, and people were sending it around, like I said, we're sending around these charts of zmanim for different locations, sort of a mock-up. I think Agudas Yisrael, which is this is sort of their thing, and as we'll see, this was they were involved in this parsha back in the 70s as well. So you hear from them again because they do lobby the government on a federal level about laws affecting the Jewish community. So I think they sent one of the lists of zmanim going around was coming from Aguda. Then there were other versions of it going around, either focused on one particular place or on multiple places. So this is if you're not on the WhatsApp, you're not on the news, maybe on the news websites. I haven't checked them myself, so maybe you haven't seen this, heard about this. But a lot of people are definitely talking and chattering about it as we speak.
It comes to mind that there's really another whole aspect to this, and I don't know how much we should get into this, but first of all, to understand the history of standard time in general, meaning that there's a time zone which spans hundreds of miles, that all the places, all the cities within that time zone keep to the same time, rather than just the scientific noon being noon and working around from there in each location. So that's also, in the scheme of things, fairly recent in the last couple hundred years. But then sort of the shtetl or city question, back in the shtetl, even if once there was standard time, that didn't mean that the Yidden had to run their lives around that. Until today, you have like these pockets, like sometimes in summer camps, or places where you're kind of in your own cocoon, where you have camp time or things like that. It's actually interesting. One of the, if I recall, the Vishnitz Rebbe of Monsey, Ramatala, he did not do summertime at all. From his part, I mean, he was obviously a big kanoi. I don't think it was coming because of the convenience of Shachris or Ma'ariv or Zmanim. I think it was just like, why should I change my clock? Because the government said, like, I'll just keep to the standard time. Why should I change to daylight savings? So again, that's an interesting aspect of this, and I think in 2026 that would probably be impossible for any Jewish community to sort of run things on a different clock than the rest of the country. But it's another interesting aspect of it.
Oh, there's definitely tons and tons to say on that, both on the general notion of how time used to be observed and how time is observed now, and as you mentioned, as you referenced, it's around the last 200 years or so with the invention of the railroad, the railways. That's often it's often given the credit or blamed for the time zones and the unified time, because in order to operate the Balbatasha Railroad, you need to have a time that everyone understands and can compare and use. So you say the train is arriving at 8:30. Everyone has to know what 8:30 means. It has to have a clear definition. It can't be relative and subjective, and every town has a different 8:30. So that's generally how it's explained. Obviously, also just the evolution of timekeeping devices is its own fascinating thing. And a couple of years ago, maybe I was looking into the earliest mentions of timekeeping devices in Shulchan Aruch, Benachas Shabbos, about the being mashmiya koil, and to understand what those first time sort of pre-modern timekeeping devices were. There was no face to the clock, there were no hands. It literally was just sort of a machine that made a noise every hour or so. And that's what you find, that it's mentioned in the early Ashkenazi sources, the Ogur, maybe the Maharil, and from there into Shulchan Aruch, and that's where the first mention of time and Mashmiya Koil comes in, the Gabi Shabbos. Then you have later discussions about it as the timepieces themselves evolve. You often see discussion of them in Shabbos. Once they were portable, got to be carrying, got to be wearing, pocket watches, wristwatches, etc.
The questions but even before pocket watches, I don't remember if it's the Maharil about one of the Rishonim Ashkenaz talk about in Hilchos Muktzah, but there he's talking about something similar to a sand timer, like that not that tells you the time of the day, but just something that measures units of time, like how long does something take. And then that same discussion in Shulchan Aruch evolves into talking about pocket watches.
Right. Yeah. So that's that's why this stuff is interesting from a halachic perspective, from understanding what's going on in the Shulchan Aruch and the Nesei Kelim and the Rishonim and late Rishonim with regard to that. Recently, unrelated, but recently I saw it, the Mechaber is the one to talk about attaching keys to oneself in creative ways to carry those. It's interesting to trace how these...
You once, I'm sorry, you once wrote somewhere about some story about the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe with a clock, and did they have clocks, what type of clocks they had? Do you recall that?
Exactly. So, that's another related question I had, whether it was a couple months or years ago, where I was trying to trace within this context, this larger sociological context of what role did time play and what kind of timepieces did people actually have access to or in their homes. And so, as an example, I used early Chabad to see how often and where do we see references to timepieces and to keeping time. And it's an interesting way to go about looking into it. But one should never assume that things were the way they are now in terms of time, in terms of measuring time. But on the other hand, certainly from the Tzemach Tzedek and Marash and on, we know, like I just said, with the railroad, and that was the tracks were laid out in Russia during the Tzemach Tzedek's time, maybe slightly going into the Marash's time. So I think from then on, we know that the Marash's Zman for Shachris was exactly, whether it was 8:30 in the morning, whatever the exact time was. We start seeing specific set times that the Marash, and certainly the Marash probably had timepieces on him in a more modern, contemporary kind of way. But the question is, before that, the time the Alter Rebbe Mittler Rebbe, what would keeping time have looked like in their day? Presumably, it is different. Our letters from the Alter Rebbe to the Chassidim about what time they should gather in the shul, and he writes from Zman HaKayetz, Zman HaChorev, two dramatically different because they lived very, very north. So Zman HaKayetz, the day is dramatically longer than it is.
But there was no muster of daylight savings then, was there?
No, presumably not. No. So the history of daylight savings.
Reminded me, if I could tickle your language thing. There's today we say Fir Azege Finf Azege, but I believe in the old Russian way they said Azege Fir Azege Finf.
Right. Okay. You have to know what language they're translating from.
Yeah. Also, what time is it? Yeah, and they say it's Vifel Azege, whereas in today's Yiddish, and certainly in America, I think people say like Vosid Zeit or something like that.
Which again is just often just translating from the other major language that's casting a shadow on how Yiddish is spoken. Right. There's also how you say like 3:30. Amol in Yiddish, you would say halb vier, half an hour to 4. But specifically,
there's still it's in America, by the way. It's the R. I know somebody who's from Boston, and they say for 3:30 they say half 4. Okay, so even in other languages, interesting. But here in New York City, that's not how anyone ever speaks in English, and as far as I know, and in Yiddish also, I don't think it says as much of a thing anymore. No, certainly I can tell you in London, in Stamford Hill, halb vier means 3:30.
Right. Okay, no, I'm sure it's still around, but it depends which pocket of the population you're plugged into. Ultimately, I can only speak for what I know, what I hear. I don't hear people saying the time in Yiddish too often anyway, so maybe I'm not the best representative. Anyway, time is a fascinating topic. There are entire books that have been written on the history of time and the history of telling time, keeping time. And how time is experienced. Until today, you go to South America, you go to cities and towns in South America, and 2 o'clock doesn't mean 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock means 3, 4, 5 o'clock. I think there was once someone who wrote that they did a study, and depending on how accurate or inaccurate the town clock, the bank clock was, that could sort of tell you how time is measured and perceived in a particular place. So there are places, even obviously everyone has access to clocks and electricity, but maybe not with smartphones that will tell the time. Maybe things have changed. But as of at least the pre-smartphone era, It definitely sounded like there were plenty of places with other, like I said, South America is what comes to mind, where the culture of time was still, I guess you could say, Freizeitisch, sort of a pre-modern. They probably don't have railroads there. That's maybe that's part of it. Maybe that's not. You have to study what the transportation of a particular place is, and how they're connected, and how much they move around, and how much it may get to them to be able to know the time and tell the time accurately. But as of 20, 30 years ago, there certainly were still many places where time was perceived very differently, which ties really into learning about how time was perceived as Manar Yishainim. And looking Alter Rebbe, even Alter Rebbe in the Siddur, right? Speaking of Alter Rebbe and time, Alter Rebbe talks about the Zman in the Siddur, talks famously Lagabe Shabbos, and as far as I recall, clocks and timekeeping pieces are not part of the equation at all. It's the the Chama Barashi Hayalanis. I was actually just driving with my son, dropping him off in camp. It was somewhere 7:30, 7:45. That was around the time of the day that it was, and I noticed that the Chama was Barashi Hayalanis. I said, look at that. That's, I guess, we don't even, in the day-to-day life, not even outside of that time, looking at the tops of the trees. Also, within the city, you don't really have rows of trees. But to be driving down a quiet road around that time of the day, and to see the Chama Barashi Hayalanis.
I think, you know what? I think something just clicks for me about the Alter Rebbe and the Lashonis Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. First of all, just to mention also, we had recently in Chitas in Igeras Trove, where he says, I think 2 or 3 hours before there's something about this man when the fast starts, where he says, I think, but a vague time, but also Sayin Hilchas Tefillin and Hilchas Tzitzis, the Alter Rebbe taught, it's a famous stira, the Rebbe speaks about it, about one place he says Hesach Hadas is 1 or 2 hours, and another place he says 2 or 3 hours. So the question is always how to be miyash of the stira between Chassid and Chassitzis, but each place like in today's language, what does 1 or 2 hours mean? Is it 1 hour or is it 2 hours? And I think it basically means that in those days the people didn't think of an hour so rigid as we think about it today.
Right, so that's also an important factor to understand. That's very good. Right, so I mean, today is always people. It's a thing people in to figure out what's the exact take off a talis on Shabbos for a kiddush. You put the talis back on. That's often a common scenario where people want to wear the talis home, things like that. And I think maybe I've even heard by mitzvah pshatlach that revolve around this nakuda.
Are you aware of anything about an official minhag of wearing a talis home on Shabbos? Somebody recently asked me that in the what we would call in the Hasidic Kreisen, they have a garment which I guess we would call a coat. They call it a shvolka, but Be'etzem its place was to take this place of a talis. For example, in the many Kreisen, they're makbid to wear it for Kabbalah Shabbos because. Right. The old minhag was to wear a talis for Kabbalah Shabbos. So, like, there's this thing of being makbid to walk home in the street with a talis or with a rishvolka. Maybe it had to do with making kiddush, or they made kiddush Shabbos day with a talis, so they wore it home to be able to make kiddush with it.
You're saying those that are medayik to wear a rishvolka at night, they don't necessarily wear it by day. They wear the talis instead. So you're saying then there's a diuk, just as there's a diuk to wear the ober beged, the ober malbush. At night, which is that malbush, so he's saying then by day the upper malbush is the talis.
Something like that. I'm not familiar intimately with all the different minhagim and kreisen, but my hunch is that this does trace back to some old minhag Ashkenaz.
And you know what Chabad discourse this ties into? The Rebbe wearing a coat over the kapata on Shabbos, and everyone always says it's to cover the silk, and every time the conversation comes up, I say, what does covering the silk mean? You have a mucker that you're supposed to cover silk?
The Rebbe, besides whatever the reason why the Rebbe was makbid to wear a coat on Shabbos, the etzem, it's funny be'etzem because the whole minhag of Chassidim was to wear silk to avoid wearing wool because of shilas of shatnez, and here the Rebbe is covering the silk with a wool coat. It was I'm not
right. Yeah, so first of all, the history of wearing silk on Shabbos is only interesting in the early Chassidus, where they were, that was, you look in Kerem Chabad 4 from Munshine, the documents relating to the arrest and the whole parsha, and that was like one of the nicknames, I forgot how it's what the word is in Russian, but one of the nicknames for Chassidim, I think in Russian, was those that wear silk.
It also came up in the
like
Takanos in the early days of the Gzeres HaMabushim, when there was confusion exactly what the Gzeres were. So some places or some people thought that it had to do with they didn't like that the Yidden were wearing silk. It was too too loud.
There's the history of the fancy term is the sumptuary laws of either governments or Jews, Jewish communities themselves, putting hagbalas on the kind of clothing that the Jewish people could wear. Just now in the news this week, there was some weird item about a $16,000 sheitel, and that it all ties into the same. It all ties into the same nakuda of trying to govern and regulate what Jews can wear. Today, it's pretty much out of control because we don't really have proper self-governance as a Jewish community. That's its own discussion, or the history of Jewish communities and how they were organized and what their power was. And today we sort of have like an echo and like a dimion of what the power is and how the power is supposed to work, but without putting in the time and the effort to figure out how power actually operates and how Jewish communities can or can't have power over their members. Certainly at this time, certainly in America for sure, but even relatively in Israel, people have the freedom to wear whatever they want. It's very hard. The only power you have today is usually through the moistus. The moistus are sort of, well, as I like to say, the moistus are sort of the replacement today of the old kahal and the old kehillah. So the only ones that are really bekayach, that have the power to institute these types of laws and restrictions, or at least to attempt to, are the moistus, and where the call could originally excommunicate you and kick you out. So today the moistus can throw the children out. So functionally, that is where the power is, and that's where the takanas are, and that's where the chayrim, without using formal halachic modes of chayrim, but functionally, kids being thrown up in moistus is the modern day chayrim. And we're going off topic.
Yeah, let's get back.
Off topic. So if we could just pull that thread all the way back.
We'll go back to the hour and 2 hours of Atalis. That's how we got into this. But,
I'm sure there are a few more interesting details I wanted to say on the way back. But okay, we'll just we'll go all the way back 2-3 hours of Atalis, and we're talking about time. We're talking about time. So. Which nakuda of time were we talking about specifically? So we're saying certainly the history of time is very different. Certainly before the railroad and all that, and even afterwards. So at some point so you have the time zones, and then at some point you start having this concept. So time zone by definition means that you don't have true time. Most locations are not using true time in the sense that chatzos is not when the sun is directly over their head. For the whole, as you alluded to earlier, the whole idea of a time zone is that everyone within the zone, within half an hour, meaning the center of the zone, the center of each zone has the correct time.
I'm going to avoid triggering you by mentioning the question of Kiddush between 6 and 7 in different locations.
Right. That ties into that's usually if you're into understanding halacha and time, that is the case where you would be nisayr to understanding this nakuda about how time zones work. So essentially the center of every time zone is an hour. The center of every time zone, I forgot how many miles it is, I looked it up once, how the length of every time zone. But the center of the time zone has the truest time, the most correct time, and then everyone to the right and to the left, half an hour in each direction is up to half an hour off from the true time for their location, which reminds me of the point you made about whichever Rebbe you mentioned that refuses to use daylight savings time, which is something that I do relate to. I have a side of me that, chatzos means, 12 o'clock means chatzos, and chatzos means the sun is over your head. So what do you mean that, noon is 1 o'clock? What does that mean? It's a nonsensical statement where to some extent it does tie into the fact that, we can make a more general rant about how so much of what we interact with today we don't fully understand. It's like bedafka, almost feels like everything bedafka is sort of murky and confused. So nothing ever means what it is supposed to mean or what we think it means. And upon further inspection, you realize, okay, whatever you thought is not what it actually is.
I
So,
definitely do
even
have go on.
go ahead.
I definitely do have an awareness the whole summer that we're an hour off. Like, it's not. I never forget that we're on savings time. And question is, if Itaka changes to become year-round savings time, if to what extent people will still maintain that awareness.
Right. So that to me, that's just part of. Forget about the zmanim. To me, permanent daylight savings time is like an assault on reality and our basic perception of reality, basic perception of time. Again, not to make it political, but I'm sure there are other areas in which people can complain that we're having, there could be an assault on reality from different angles. So to me, like I said, the Zmanim, there are a lot of Lubavitchers that to them, the Zmanim of Alois, Mishiaker, Net, Mechetese, Shachris, earliest Shachris is 10 o'clock, and it only goes later from there. So, Bechlal, some Lubavitchers feel left out of this whole hubbub and uproar, and that itself tells you it's interesting insight into how different communities perceive and experience and practice Judaism in relatively radically different ways, even though everyone davens Shachris, but what Shachris means, and that's its own interesting conversation as to what Shachris means and what's the definition of Shachris, and if our rhythms of time, our rhythms of reality, when we wake up, changes radically. So even though it's hard to go up against the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, but it's an interesting thing to think about. But without getting into that, the idea of perception of reality, the idea that even time, right? So at this point, nothing means, you say money, right? Money, today we're almost not, first of all, money used to be metal, right? You have a few people, I'm not saying I'm a gold, I'm not hoarding gold, but I could relate to those that think that gold is real and everything else is not so real. So first you go from gold to paper, and then you go from paper to not digital currency, but digital. When we say, "Oh, I'm sending you money from my phone to your phone," that's not money. There's no money involved in any sense, any definition of the term, right? So the way we use language and the way we're taking concepts that used to exist, which money was a concrete concept, and we're taking those words and we're using them in ways in which they don't really apply. We shouldn't be calling them money. We should be saying, I'm transferring some of the debt the bank owes to me to you. Now the bank, some bank will owe that money to you, right? So if you want to be more accurate, you want to be correct, you would have to say something along those lines. Now it's very annoying and pedantic to say it that way. So it certainly is more convenient to say money. But then at some point, this isn't what I came to rant about right now, but I think this does reach into every aspect of our life, including the way halachas are explained and halachas are presented, and we touched on this last week a bit with tefillin. Nothing is ever clearly defined and properly defined, and then at some point, if you lose the correct definition, so are you even doing the thing that you think you're doing, or are you doing an approximation, a facsimile, something that is me'ain to me'ain of the thing you're doing?
So many people, the only time they handle cash is, machzor shekel and tanis Esther.
Saying actual money, actual silver currency, right? Where the currency is sort of derived, at least it was originally derived from the amount of silver that was in the coin. Right. So even a coin that doesn't have silver is already a facsimile of the real thing that has silver and gold. And then you have paper money. And then you have, like I said, you send money on Cash App, and I don't know if it still does it, but it used to make this little like a clinking sound, like a bunch of coins are landing in your phone, right? So it's like everything is, you're being conditioned to like imagine that like. Yeah.
The question is, if you do the Cash App with a ding, does that count for Erev Yom Kippur, where you need to make the noise for the?
Right. I mean, I've had done discussions shiurim on whether it can be makadosh with Cash App, but in order to answer that, you have to start getting into these questions. Makadosh b'milva, being makadosh with a choiv, and that's which is a sugya in the Gemara.
There's a whole sefer, yeah.
Check b'halacha, right. So this point about time, where I can relate. So even this Rebbe, though, you're saying he's being meicha against daylight savings time. So I can very much can very much relate to that. He's going the opposite extreme where there's no daylight savings time. Although I would point out that we just mentioned about the time zones, that I'm still pretty sure he's not being machashav chatzos unless he moved to the center of the time zone, but unless he's smart enough or whatever, he knows to do that. So you should lahire that he's still not following correct time if he's anywhere but the center.
That we already have from tzaddikim of previous days that they would makabel the time zones. So.
Or we had tzaddik. I thought you were going to say you have tzaddikim from previous generations that they bend the time to their, wherever they are, chatzos is over them, and forget about the astronomy. Either way, so this is all b'derech hakdama before we get into the technical. How should you daven shachris when they change the time? It's I think what we were doing here was trying to zoom out a bit and provide us a larger perspective on the evolution of time, the evolution of measuring time, of setting time, whether it's time zones and daylight savings time, and how much we're sort of messing. And so let's say, in other words, if you are operating with daylight savings time and not permanent daylight savings time, your perception of time and your relation to time is like the furthest possibly removed from what real natural time would have been to someone who's looking at the sky for alois and for nets and looking for chatzos and for shkia and for tzeis. We know till I have a sefer Azmanim B'Havana, interesting sefer, where he brings edus in that in many communities shtetlach, up until perhaps the Holocaust, up until World War II, they had a minig that oitz Shabbos, for Shabbos to go out, even though they had zmanim and they had luchas, and all of these things were invented, which are also recent inventions, to have a luach hazmanim. Its own interesting development in history, and the fact that we process all of our halachic zmanim through these luchas and through these preset times is itself a tremendous rupture. Speaking, we were talking about ruptures the other day elsewhere. It's a tremendous rupture in how halacha is observed and perceived and understood. And it sounds like though there were communities that the tradition was at Shabbos you look for something in the sky, whatever simanim, even though halachically whether we know what the kechavim, gedolim, binoinim, ktanim, whatever the exact halachic discussion there is, but they had episode as to what they were supposed to be looking for in the sky. And so this whole thing, the lights would go out, meaning the Chassidish shuls, they have the lights go out now on a Shabbos clock. But the sun would be setting, and there were no candles, obviously. It was already 24 hours since they lit the candles the night before. There were no candles. And it's getting darker and darker, and they're sitting in the darkness, and they're looking at the sky to see something, whatever simanim they were looking for in the sky. And then they would say Baruch Hu, and then maybe Eresh then, either a guy or whatever the exact arrangement was, they got the light on in the shul. And it could be they had electricity by then also. But there were shuls that still did it the traditional way, Matzah Shabbos. So it's an entirely different experience of Matzah Shabbos compared to, you're sitting looking at the clock on the wall and the luach on the fridge, and okay, now it's 8:39, Lamer Zagen. Okay, now I'm going to turn on the lights. Totally different experience of halachic time as well.
So also, the general tzva shamayim. You're reminding me. I was talking to a friend the other day in England, and he's going after Tisha B'av with his family to someplace in what we call in England the countryside. And so it's, I don't know exactly, but it's basically a place where it's very dark at night. There's not a lot of street lights and stuff. So he's found some website to print for himself or to create for himself a detailed astrolabe to be able to look at the sky and know what he's looking at.
Right. So that's a whole nother, what's the term? Light pollution, I think is the term I'm looking for. Yeah. The amount of light pollution that we have today compared to even 200 years ago, never mind to 200-300 years ago, is also atrocious. And maybe this will tie into something else we wanted to talk about, but people used to look up at the sky and it was magical. You look at the sky and all the things that Torah says about the Shemesh and the Reich and the Kechavim and so many sources that we have. The sky was alive. There were things going on in the sky. People's perception of themselves, of reality, of the gods, for those that believed in multiple gods, it all makes a lot more sense when you're looking up at the sky and the sky looks like it's teeming with movement and with light. Today, living in the city, if you live anywhere near industrial lights, the sky is essentially blank. It's essentially empty. Maybe you see one dot here, one dot there. I think I was just realizing even recently, compared to when I was we go up to the country. You mentioned the countryside in England. Here in New York, we have the country. If I recall correctly, when I was a kid in the country, the sky, I don't know, I'm sure it doesn't matter only how much light you have in your little colony. If there's a big industrial plant a mile away that has a lot of light, it still can ruin the sky for you. But as a kid, looking up at the sky in the country, we definitely saw a sky full of stars, and the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper, that was... I guess I was noticing that look up at the sky now in the colony that I was in this summer, previous summers, and you don't really see much in the sky there either. And I guess just the amount of lights even that bungalow colonies have now compared to what they had back then, back 20, 25 years ago, is dramatically different. So I'm just realizing even in my own life, even in my own experience, you can't really see any. I'm sure what I saw then wasn't the full sky, but at least there was something. And now you can't really see that either. It's something you can look up. You can look up online. There's a ranking system for how clear the sky is in different locations. And you could look up what are the nearest locations that have the clearest possible sky, whatever the top ranking is, an A or a 1 or whatever the exact system is. I remember looking it up a couple of summers ago. There's in Maine, New Hampshire, for the Northeast, there are certain spots that are known to where you can actually see the clear sky. I do have a bit of a rutzen to go camping in one of these places sometime and actually see the sky. So that's just another example of,
maybe you could you could lead a tour. People could pay to come with you, and we'll go all the Mekayros and Chazal and in Tanakh and.
All right. Okay. Sign up now. Sign up now for updates on on when the tour is taking place. But there are people that are conspiracy theorists. They say they look at the sky and the sun doesn't look the same. The clouds don't look the same. So I can't speak to that. I can't say I've noticed that the sun and the clouds don't look the same. But it's like a whole conspiracy theory where they're doing something to us. They're ruining the sky for us. Right. So let's assume that's totally a crank conspiracy theory. But what is true is that that's the case at night. They whoever they are, capitalism, industrialism, etc., they stole the nighttime sky from us. And that was a very, very powerful part of people's lives up until 200 years ago, and now it's just completely gone, it's completely vanished. So instead of, like I said, the conspiracy theory is basic niche, but the night sky is a fact. That is an absolute fact. And people now go to certain points in the north. They'll go to Iceland or wherever to see the sky looks even more interesting the more north you go. Regardless of whether there are lights or there aren't, meaning whether the light pollution is ruining it or not, the sky, I think, gets more interesting the more north you go. But even without that aspect of it, you just need to find a spot where you can actually see the sky. And that's not a conspiracy. That's just a very plain fact. But people, for some reason, the conspiracy theorists aren't screaming about that. They're screaming about
we have to. It's a whole new the hair in the medrash that we all grew up on. That Avraham Avinu sits there as a kid contemplating the sky. Like that's what he's doing.
100%. The whole Avraham Avinu. If Avraham Avinu Nebuch was born in our time, in our place, the whole story wouldn't happen. You look up at the sky and he'd see nothing, and that would be that. I mean, you still see the sun rising and the moon. Even that we barely pay attention to because of all the distractions we have in front of us. Like I said, even just seeing the Cham of Rosh Hashanah was
so recently. I was looking at the Sefer Chinuch and Parshas Pinchas on Rosh Chodesh. I don't remember the pratim, but he gives like a whole list of different activities like chopping wood and whatever that people schedule based on the moon cycle. And it just struck me how like he's just talking about how the Weltfritzach, and like nowadays besides from Yidden and I don't know whatever other Havdil groups, most people have no instinctive awareness of where you are in the lunar month.
Yeah, they wouldn't even be plugged into that, be aware of that, unless you're into astronomy or something. But yeah, because of Kiddush Levana and Bechal, Rosh Chodesh, so we have a bit more of an awareness of at least of where the moon is holding. But yeah, but it's like even that we're hanging on to, we're holding on to, and that's the only time we look up. Kiddush Levana, you look up at the moon. Otherwise, why would you be paying attention to the moon? The moon also has it. There's the moonrise, there's the moon set.
Also, the whole message of saying Shalom
interesting.
Aleichem by Kiddush Levana is also the original point was that you're demonstrating how you can be nana from the Eira Levana. You can recognize somebody even at night once the moon is already a few days old.
Right, interesting.
Again, nowadays,
and so you're standing outside with all the artificial light, so it adds to the gelächter. I mean, the whole Shalom Aleichem is a shtickle gelächter, but saying the light that you have anyway adds to the gelächter. Yeah. Maybe, like I said, even in the country, I think 25 years ago, maybe when you stepped outside, it was a bit dark, and now it doesn't feel that way anymore. So I didn't intend to, this is not tinfoil hat stuff. The tinfoil hat stuff, conspiracy theories, that's about the stuff that's nishmuskom. Not only some people, but I can eat, but, to say that they stole the sky from you, or they stole time, or the real understanding, perception, and meaning of time, I think that's not tinfoil hat stuff. That's you just have to, what are the buzzwords? You have to tune in and turn on and pay attention, and you'll notice that. So
the point is that there's a natural tuning in that people used to have, and without getting into the arichas, it also touches into shiurim of tefach, etzbah, kazayis, kabeya. These used to be things that people just you winged it, because I know what a kazayis is, I know what a tefach is, and nowadays it's all down to the various Pesach guides that
Right. But we won't go off into that at the moment. But yeah, there is a tzad hashava. There is a connection there.
All right. There's this week's parsha's dvar. The first, I think it's 11 psukim. Like Rashi says, it's a musa, but the Chazkuni says that it's a milsad of bdichasa. That to get into the conversation, you need to have. So Moshe Rabbeinu was starting his drasha with the milsad of bdichasa. So we've now had 40 minutes of the milsad of bdichasa. Let's talk for a few minutes about the gedichte.
Right. So to get into the actual the halachic history, recent halachic history. So we know this is not the first time that the United States is experimenting or thinking about experimenting with this. We know that in the winter of 1974, January 1974, was the first time that America attempted to use permanent daylight savings time. They moved the clock forward January 6th. 1974. This was under Nixon. There was an energy crisis. There was an Arab embargo, I believe, in relation to Israel. And every time this comes up in the news, including this week, if you Google it, you'll see there are articles that rehash the old history. So you can go look up the exact details in history, or you can go find the articles and stuff from back then. It's an interesting parsha, interesting story. I remember my father telling me about this parsha when I was a kid. He was telling me his memories, I think his own personal memories of this year. Anyone who was old enough was 5 years old or older in 1974 probably remembers something about this, because it was just even like as a kid, even waiting for the school bus, walking to school in the dark at 8 o'clock is memorable enough. Plus all the chakras. Well, it was that winter, and then by the next winter, I think it had been abolished, and they went back to ending daylight savings time at a normal time. And even ended at a normal time in 1973, but then they started early. They started early in 1974, and the idea was to just keep it permanent, and that didn't last. So I think it was just that winter, though. There definitely was chatter about it earlier. In 1971 or so, there was chatter about there was talk about this previously, before the energy crisis fully kicked in. And so, I think in this past week there's been a letter from Rav Moshe. I don't know if it was ever published before. Someone just sent it to me. I think I'd seen it around and I hadn't read it. Someone sent it to me last night, and then I read it. A letter from Rav Moshe Feinstein to Rav Moshe Scherer of Aguda, which, as you mentioned, Aguda, that's sort of their thing, to get involved in these kinds of laws. So in 1971, there was a controversy. Once this was part of the discourse, and they're talking about it in Washington, so the shaila was, what about how's this going to affect Shachris for Yidden that get up at early normal times and start working at an early time, and it's going to affect the Shachris. And already back then, there were other voices that said, what about The flip side is that means Shabbos in the winter will never be crazy early, right? So let's say you work 9 to 4, and Shabbos starts 4:15. You can't stay in your office till 4. You have to leave your office early. And back then there was still less understanding, less accommodation about religious needs and not discriminating. The whole history of religious discrimination against Jews in America is its own interesting parsha, and klal adding Saturday as a rest day was something that was brought about. The way it's described is brought about in combination by Jewish interests and the workers' unions together in the early 1900s. The point that it shouldn't just be Sunday off, a 6-day work week, but rather a 5-day work week with Saturday and Sunday off. Once that was brought into effect, the amount of Shmira Shabbos, we know when Jews came to America, the early immigrants to America struggled tremendously with Shmira Shabbos, in part for
that
this
was
reason.
as early as the 1900s? The change?
The change is somewhere, I don't remember the exact date, but in the 1910s and the 1920s, this is what they were working on. I don't. You'd have to go check to see federally and on a state level when exactly it kicked in. But we know when we think about Jewish observance being very tenuous in America at an early point for the immigrants, and then it slowly, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, post-Holocaust, suddenly religious observance suddenly kicks in. So sometimes we talk about the immigrants that come after the war, but there already were things, there were processes that were in place already before that led to America being more hospitable to Orthodox Judaism, and definitely a major factor was the 5-day work week and Saturday being a day off. For that would be for workers. In the case of stores, often you had the blue, what were they called? The blue laws that forbade opening stores on Sunday, which was it's not, there's a separation of church and state. Okay, so we actually just paused there mid-sentence for technical reasons, so I didn't keep that sentence in my head, but I'll resume be'arach from where I was just talking. No, essentially, if you lived in a town, in a city that didn't allow stores to be open on Sunday, so then as a storekeeper to also close your store on Saturday was also just felt financially impossible. And I think chipping away at those laws, so I can't speak comprehensively about the laws in every single place, but I think the fact that it was normalized and more acceptable to close on Saturday and be open on Sunday potentially, so you didn't. Workers wanted a 5-day work week, but store owners didn't want a 5-day store week. So that was also an issue. But that's a separate aspect of Shabbos here in America. But focusing more on the work week, that really changed things for Shabbos observance in America. Why was I saying this?
I was talking about the changing of the Aguda campaigning for the Jewish.
Right. So when it comes to this aspect of it, the question was, on the one hand, this makes Shacharis difficult for people. On the other hand, Shabbos, even with the 5-day work week, even with working on Friday, but if Shabbos comes in 4:15, then you can't really, certainly if you have a 9 to 5 job, or even 9 to 4, you sort of have to leave the office 3 o'clock. And back then, there was still less accommodation and more discrimination, not to the extent that there was before the 5-day work week, but it was still an issue. And presumably there were still Yidden that still had the same Nisayan. We know we speak of the Nisayan Yidden had, the early immigrants had, but even in the 70s, maybe even till today, there are Yidden that have a shtickle Nisayan.
Today I know in South Africa, and there's also a big South African community in Australia, there's many of them who are, you can't call it trove Shabbos, but they don't work on Shabbos, and they have Kiddush and Asuda Shabbos or whatever it is, but they stay the full day or work on Friday.
Interesting.
I was in Australia last year. There was a South African community. There must have been, I don't know, a few hundred people came to shul on Friday night, but Kabbalah Shabbos was 2 hours after Shabbos came in.
Interesting. Maybe that explains why the chief rabbi of South Africa made a whole trask out of community Shabbos a couple of years ago. Remember that?
Yeah. I'm more familiar with South African satellite communities, but yeah.
maybe that was part of it, because Shabbos is still this challenge. Okay, so you see there are Yidden that's still, meaning today we tend to think of like either you're Orthodox, ultra Orthodox, and you're, at this point it's not an Nisayan for whatever reason, however you work it out, it's not an Nisayan. Or you're, the way we look at it today is, or you're Stam Nishkan Yid. But the truth is, as you're saying, that there still are many Yidden, whatever the exact number is, and how many of them are in America or other places, there are Yidden that still have a certain tmimus, and they're still, on the one hand, they would be willing to keep Shabbos, or they try to bring in Shabbos at the right time, but they feel anusim, even if Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jews in the same situation wouldn't feel that way, but that's how they feel. So the question is, do we care about these people? Are we factoring that in? Are we factoring in that Shabbos, if Shabbos comes in an hour later, that might make the difference for however many number of Jews? And I saw that even just this week, with the discussion coming up again, there were voices that were voicing this point, that why are you only talking about Shacharis in the morning? What about when Shabbos comes in Friday afternoon? So it's interesting that there's this letter from Rav Moshe to Rav Moshe Sher of Aguda, specifically addressing this. It's interesting to see Rav Moshe's opinion. Rav Moshe had a very strong opinion that we only care about the Jews that have an issue with Shacharis, who keep Shabbos properly, and their only issue is Shacharis. And if there are Jews that their problem is Shabbos, so essentially looking at them as chaytim, and we're not b'chuyev to ruin our Shacharis for their Shabbos. It's a little. He writes it very harshly, and it's interesting to see. It's hard to imagine. It's interesting to think about what the Lubavitcher Rebbe would have said about that shaila. There's this general process that I think about. I don't know if it's been observed. I don't know if there's a name for it, but you rewind 100 years ago. You look at Poland. The amount of Jews in Poland that are dropping observance, let's say, is very high. But back then, a Rav of a city in Poland still felt the achrayas for all the Jews in his city, whatever it is, 100,000, 200,000, 1 million Jews. They were all still his flock. Whether or not he was thinking about it day and night, but just it expressed itself in certain policies, in certain things. For example, Erevin, the early modern history of Erevin, and certain kulas, or the way we use telegraph poles or telephone poles and telephone string, etc. A lot of this goes back to Poland in the early 1900s. And it's clear that a big part of their motivation was the fact that you have all these people that are going to be Mechal Shabbos, and maybe they're mostly keeping Shabbos in other ways, but this is just one area where it's just not gonna happen. So we have to come up with we have to say there's an Erev, one way or another. We have to declare there's an Erev, the place has an Erev, and they can carry. Somewhere between beginning and end of World War II, most of the Orthodox world sort of retreats within itself, and we sort of retreat geographically, and we just build communities of like-minded people, and therefore we relinquish and we drop the responsibility and the achrayas for other communities, for other types of Jews, for shvacher types of Jews, and they're sort of not even part of the equation. Of course, the higher up you go on the pole of extreme, you go to Satmar, or you go to these other communities, they're barely even greatest. The modern Orthodox barely exist in there. Never mind people that are even schwacher than that. The lower you go down, if you're modern Orthodox, you're probably a lot more aware of the people that are borderline Orthodox, that are kind of keeping, but not keeping, but trying to keep. Chabad, we're in an interesting position, in which, on the one hand, in certain ways, we're still. Obviously, it's debatable if Chabad ultra-Orthodox or not, but let's say Chabad is, for the sake of the argument, Chabad in certain ways is ultra-Orthodox. But on the other hand, because the Rebbe is like the only ultra-Orthodox leader that essentially did not agree with this move that the Orthodox world made, and that we still have that the whole idea of shlichus, of going out to communities, is because we are just, the way I see it is, we're actually just keeping the age-old Jewish attitude, which is that we are one large Jewish community, and Mela Reform or other groups that if they were mitzi atzma b'toich klal, maybe that's a different discussion.
But it says a group, not as individuals. I think that's the chiluk. And in Europe, I could say again, going back to England. It's not in England. There are many Jews who lay Sata very far from Shmiras Torah mitzvahs, but when they go to shul, and for some of them it might even be on a regular basis, they go to an Orthodox shul.
Exactly. I think early shluchos the early shluchim probably didn't think of themselves as reaching out to Reform Jews. It was probably reaching out to those people that were members of communities that had been Orthodox and then they were going to turn conservative and they were dwindling. So at least initially, I think reform was maybe less our concern. Today, where that whole population of borderline Orthodox is sort of gone, so I think shlichus and the way shluchim are thinking and who they're reaching out to has shifted as well. And now we're reaching out to Jews that would have been considered reform or even less than reform. That itself has changed in the last 20, 30, 40 years. Which is its own interesting discussion, the history of shlichus and the history of the Jewish community in America, etc., and who we're reaching out to. But at least originally, there are Jews that are, and you had Jews like that even 500 years ago, even though we try to tell ourselves that everyone Amo was from Adrabah, because back then the whole Jewish community was one entity, so you had the biggest Haredim, whatever Haredi would have meant 500 years ago, very far from Chassidim, Prushim, etc. And you had people back then that were barely observant, whether within one community or in a different location. There were parts of Germany, the Jews in Alsace-Lorraine, even 500 years ago. Those communities were very schwach. And you had a few Rabbanim, you had communities without Rabbanim. You had all kinds of levels of observance throughout history. And to the extent that the rabbis were being proactive, of course they took achrayus and thought they were responsible to teach Torah to these people. You look at the places like Hungary, places like Transylvania, you see the history. There aren't Rabbanim in these places going back 500 years. There are Rabbanim going back 200 years, 250 years, and you see how it's described, how the first Rabbanim that came in from Poland, from the more gedichte, Haredish geographic areas, they came into these new areas which didn't have a history of Jewish communities, they didn't have a history of Rabbanim, and they came in, and they always describe how they came in, and Yiddishkeit was so schwach. The people, they barely knew what they were doing. They didn't have proper rabbinic guidance. And look at Transylvania. It's Bicheskel Panet. Dej came into Transylvania. You look at his son. His son printed a biography of his father. That's the whole narrative there, is that they barely knew what they were doing, and he came in and he made takanas and he taught them what had to be done. You always had, we think of our history, you can't just think of the place, Frankfurt, or even Frankfurt, I'm sure, had a shvacher element. But there are certain cities that are famous for being such a ir ve'em b'Yisrael. But for every ir ve'em b'Yisrael, you don't know what kind of shutdown there was, Erget Zvu, that had 50,000, 100,000 Jews that didn't have, and they didn't have proper Rabbanim, and they weren't observing things properly. So there were modern Orthodox Jews in some form or another going back for forever.
There were even times, I think in France, if I recall correctly, maybe in other places also, where there was many towns where there was mamash getzelte Yidden in each town, and there were Rabbanim who was like, they served as the Rav for all of these people, and in many cases they were coming to daven with a minyan with Chilul Shabbos, and there was a Shilas. I think, I seem to recall vaguely something from the brother of the Maharal, Reb Chaim. Did he maybe live in France for Tkufa?
Sure. I don't know.
But there definitely was that. And also you mentioned the Chassidi Ashkenaz. You shared, I think a few months ago, some research about the attitude of the Chassidi Ashkenaz to being Mekarev, what I think the term they probably used is Rishoyim or whatever. But
right. Interesting combination in the Torah of Chassidi Ashkenaz. On the one hand, Klal Yisrael Arivim Zelazeh, and on the other hand, Hisbadlus Mirashayim. Today, it's two different shittas. Either you have Hisbadlus Mirashayim, or you have Klal Yisrael Arivim Zelazeh. But Chassidi Ashkenaz is very fascinating to see where you see both Yisaitis. You can see, if you want to take it historically, you can say each community took half of that. The idea goes back 1,000 years. The idea of Hisbadlus Mirashayim goes back 1,000 years. The idea of Klal Yisrael Arivim Zelazeh goes back 1,000 years, and today it sort of was nischalik, and one community took this, one community took that, but to see that they both coexisted and they were both being articulated and promulgated by Chassidi Ashkenaz, it's an interesting part. But even you're talking about towns in France. There were towns in Ukraine. There were towns. You look at the history of the early Chassidus, the amount of yishivnikas that were spread. A yishivnik, an Am Haaretz, he can't read Hebrew. Only the Malamed can read Hebrew. And how do you think his kids are turning out? They're not really turning out that much better either. But at least he has the sense to bring a Malamed. And not every yishivnik had the sense to bring a Malamed. Some yishivnikas didn't bring a Malamed. So you had an entire range of observants, and obviously these people are not writing their own history. They're sort of mentioned in passing in history, so you can like even study the history a bit and like sort of tune these people out. But there always were these types of Jews that are kam and borderline, and I think to the extent, again, I'm not saying every Rav was carrying that load on his shoulder and it was keeping them up at night, but to the extent that Rabbanim had to make policies that affected their area, it would seem to me that they did take these people into account to some extent. Sometimes you have cases in Shabbos and Shuvas where the Yishivnik, like legally, like within the Jewish governance, he was considered shaykh to the nearest city. Maybe there was an afkamina for taxes. He had to pay certain taxes in order to then be able to come to the shul for Rosh Hashanah. But there were nafkaminas, and you couldn't just ignore and forget. In most cases, I think you couldn't ignore and forget that these Jews existed, and they were factored in and part of the equation in some way. The way we've reorganized ourselves post-war, where every like-minded community just bands together and can tune out and ignore every other community, has led to this tremendous shift where we just don't have to think about it, don't have to care about other types of Jews and Shvachara types of Jews. And I pointed out to someone recently, like even just look at the founder of Lakewood, where before the war, first of all, he was a Rav of Kletsk. All Rosh Yeshiva back then were Rabbanim first and Rosh Yeshiva second. And up until the war, going to yeshiva, all the Litvish yeshivas, still pshat was that you were going to come out with a smicha and become a Rav in a shtetl. And the Jews in that shtetls, observants, would be all kinds. The whole rebuilding, kaviyachal, the rebuilding after the war here in America, Lakewood, completely flips that on. It takes that element away. Smicha is banned. This truth from Rav Moshe Klein about where he complains that in Lakewood, if you take up your day off the shelf, the Rosh Yeshiva tell you that you're being nana from the yeshiva shalei kadin because we don't give reshus for you to learn your day in yeshiva. I'm sure there's more nuance to it, but b'chlalos, the smicha in order to be a community rav is completely removed from the equation. And why is that? How is that? Because it's also completely removing the achrayas to send Rabbanim and B'nai Torah to affect these Jewish communities. Now, today they have klal. They'll only do it in a very specific way. If they can set up a klal, it could be a makam Torah, but that's not how it works until then. That's not how it works.
I think are a little bit more.
Right. Okay, Chavetz Chaim is a bit different, but of course Chavetz Chaim is also they wear blue shirts and not white shirts, and so for that surah, the Ben Torah and the yeshiva in America, obviously everything is a negotiation, and you if your actions are high on one thing, you're probably giving up something else in exchange. So maybe if your actions are on white shirts, then you're not going to be able to fit in as a rav in a small shtetl. And of course, it's more complicated than what I'm saying. Obviously, back then there were huge chunks of klal yisroel that were sort of falling off and being disconnected. It was a dynamic process at the time. So I can understand the desire to withdraw, because you're going to send a Rav Ben Torah to some farvarfin American shtetl. You don't know if he himself will have a decision to go. They're going to make him a sugar about mechitza, make him a sugar about the microphone on Shabbos. The shul is going to want to become conservative. You had Orthodox rabbis that came from an Orthodox yeshiva, and then their shul became conservative, and then they were the Orthodox rabbi of a conservative shul. I'm not just giving a black and white picture here, but functionally.
I read the drasha from we spoke about from Greenwald from Cincinnati. He gave a kol nidre drasha that he made the shvua al das rabbim or something that he'll never step foot into if they take away the mechitza, or if they become conservative. I don't remember the exact language he used. That he would, and Taka, his shul Taka remained Orthodox for many years, even in Cincinnati.
Interesting. So, of course, it was more complex at that time, and you want to make a tevas noyach, especially when there's a mabel outside. Today, we don't. It's not. We have other challenges today. We don't have a mabel of like thousands of Jews that are like leaving Orthodoxy in the way it was happening then. And even then, and Kol Shekei now, the way Chabad looks at it, to me, is really. It's not like, oh, the Rebbe came up with this unusual way of looking at things. No, technically it's the normal way, it's the traditional way of looking at things, which is that the entire Jewish community is one community, and the stronger, the starker have a certain achrayas for the shvachara, and the rest of the Jewish community has decided to abandon that achrayus, so it's left to Lubavitch to be the only ones left that still carry that achrayus. It's not even a Lubavitch thing per se. It's a Jewish thing, and this is just an example where Lubavitch is keeping that Jewish value alive. Of course, we have to send Rabbanim to places to again, things have changed because back then you had borderline Orthodox people. You could convince them to return, to send their kids to yeshiva. That was still a thing in the 50s and 60s. If you were mashpia on the right family, they would just send their kids to yeshiva, and the trajectory of that family would change. The world we live in today, where that doesn't really exist anymore, and you're dealing with people who are married to a non-Jew, and the one parent is non-Jew. It's a bit of a different situation, which is its own discussion, which we're not going to get into right now. But at least for the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, it was still this continuation of what people who were alive then would have remembered from 50, 60, 70 years before, where of course yeshivas exist to create rabbanim who will then be mashpia on shvach communities. So that's all. So even to see Rav Moshe, I'm all saying this as the Maimar Muska, to see Rav Moshe say we only care about those that are for sure keeping Shabbos, and now Shachris is a challenge to them. And we mamish don't care about those that they're struggling with Shabbos because of this man. To me, it's a little hard to stomach, and it also feels a little bit like that withdrawing. I'm sure Rav Moshe was a bit more embedded, and he was definitely getting shilas from the span of the Orthodox world in America at the time. I'm sure he was getting shilas from modern Orthodox communities. I'm sure he was plugged in, tuned in to a range of behavior and practice and observance in the Jewish world. But it's still reading that was a little hard to stomach, with the Zabin Toikef, that we only care about this, we don't care about that. It's not part of, it should not be part of the equation, it should not be part of the consideration whatsoever. They're just chaytim, and we don't, whatever the exact formulation, how he formulates it. So that was in 1971.
Yeah, I just, 71 or 74, you said?
No, this letter was a few years earlier, when Aguda was still lobbying, when they were talking about permanent daylight savings time, and Aguda was lobbying against it. One of the articles I found from 1974, Aguda is quoted as saying that we lobbied successfully against it for the last couple of years. But now with the energy crisis and the embargo, they didn't see, it didn't feel right. They didn't think it was even appropriate for them to try to lobby, to try to fight it. It wouldn't look patriotic. The whole country's coming together they were waiting in lines at gas stations, whatever was going on at the time. But the energy crisis, it wasn't a pashut at the time. So clearly I wonder, klal, with this letter of Rav Moshe, is there an archive of letters from Rav Moshe to Rav Moshe Sher to Aguda in the Yonei HaKlal? Would there have been a letter from 1974 from Rav Moshe about how they should back off? It's interesting. I didn't look into it. I don't know if it's ever been properly explained or defined where these letters are, where they're coming from, who has them. Also, there could be archives that were abandoned, and then someone finds boxes and boxes, or a good Rabbanim's archive. I think someone we know at some point got his hands on the whole Agudas Rabbanim archive and took it to his house, and we might have stuff like that there, which Rav Moshe was part of that organization, I believe, back in the day, and some of those askonistic stuff might have gone through that entity.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of should wrap up, but another related halachic issue, which is part of this discussion, which is interesting for a number of reasons from Chabad perspective, is the attitude to saying Krishma without tefillin and made it the sheker b'atzmai. First of all, I think, nothing's fresh in my mind, but I think that there's some interesting chidushim in the diuk of the way the Alter Rebbe, what the Alter Rebbe writes in Shulchan Aruch about this din. And also in practice, I think in Chabad until this door, we were machmir to, if you say Krishma before davening, to put on tefillin. But nowadays, I think it's Yechidim who do that, and most people are fine to say Krishma without tefillin before davening. But if more people are going to be having to switch around how they daven and how they say Krishma and when and where they put on tefillin, then the halachic sugya of Koyre Krishma b'lei tefillin k'meid sheker b'atzmai is also very relevant.
Right, that's still an interesting topic that has to be looked into and discussed separately. I think a few months ago, there was one of the videos of one of the YouTubers who came to Crown Heights to harass people. I'm not remembering the details right now, but I think in the video there was a bacher standing outside in tefillin, And I think from the video it was clear that he was, I think he was just wearing tefillin for Shema. And it was like, oh, interesting. Oh, there's still a bacher that there's still bachrim that still say Shema and Tefillin. I don't remember the exact pratim, but I remember that video was ma'ir, totally not the point of the video, but that was ma'ir, that observation. Oh, here's someone who's still doing that. In the Yud, the Rebbe still refers to it, I believe. The Sikh from Tafshin Yudalad, maybe, where the Rebbe still refers to saying Shema and Tefillin.
Certainly into Rizmim, that was the practice back in Lubavitch. But even for sure, even in the early in the Yuds and Pride, even I have a feeling that even as late as the Lameds, it was still, I don't know if it was the majority of Bachrim, but it was certainly a common thing.
Right. Okay, that's it. Like I said, that's a different topic. So just to summarize, now that we finished the Langa Hagdama, and now to say what we came to say in 5 minutes. Like we said, in 1974, there was talk about it in the years preceding, and Aguda was lobbying against it, and it didn't go ahead, possibly in part thanks to Aguda. But in late 1973, due to the energy crisis and the oil embargo, which, there are some shades of similarity to the world we are in right now with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, and it's not quite. America is producing a lot more oil and gas itself, and I'm sure there's a lot that's not similar. But it happens to be, it's interesting, there is like a mini energy crisis right now, and that's not even the reason that's being given for the permanent daylight savings time anyway. But there is some faint similarity in that the oil and gas situation is sort of nishtazai pashat due to events in the Middle East. But at any rate, due to that, the momentum for the permanent daylight savings time became very strong, and it was passed, I guess, and confirmed. And it started in January 1974. And so when I was a kid, my father told me his memories of this year, of that year, of what happened then. And I believe he mentioned to me at the time that there's a shur for Rav Moshe about it. So a couple of years ago, maybe, like I said, maybe in the president's first term, maybe there was already chatter about it back then. So actually it was set out, where's this shur of Rav Moshe? So it's actually printed in Igros Moshe, Chelik Vav, the 6th volume, which is Erech Chaim, Chelik Daled, Siman Vav. And in the title it says, when there's an issue, because of Choiser Delek, which is the inaccuracies, more modern Hebrew way of saying, look in the Rav Moshe's Lashon, it's like Shemen Hasreifa. There's a lack of Shemen Hasreifa because of the Arvim. Shemen Hasreifa is like a very archaic term, it's cute. So for some reason, though,
I'm leaking every Friday, so it's more.
Right. So the date there, though, is given as Adar Tafshin Lamed Tes, and as addressed his Einiklach, Tendler. So that was confusing because the story obviously happened in 1974, not in 1979. But then this is already a few years ago, I went and searched, and I found that around that time in the 70s, I can't tell you the exact date, but around that time, Yeshiva Mesivta Tiferes Yerushalayim, MTJ, which is where Rav Moshe was the Rosh Yeshiva, had opened a klal, Beis Medrash L'Torah V'Hira, something to that effect. I don't know if it was under the MTJ or alongside the MTJ, whatever the exact structure is, but it's connected to those moistus. And they put out a kaivetz L'Torah V'Hira. It's what we call in Chabad Kupir. It's typewritten, nothing fancy, but they put out a kaivetz. And it's in Eitzur Chachma. And if you look in the kaivetz, that kaivetz L'Torah V'Hira, from Chodev Tafshin Lamed Daled, winter of 1973, 1974, you could see that this shtickle for Rav Moshe, this Shiloh with the whole tshuva was printed in that kaivetz of Chodev Tafshin Lamed Daled. So this, at the time, it helped me confirm what I remember my father told me, that there was a tshuva for Rav Moshe from this winter of 1974. So, and it's another example of how the data and information in Igros Moshe sometimes seems a little massaged or a little edited. So
why did they change that? It's a mistake?
So I'm not sure. Maybe it's just a mistake. I think it doesn't. They don't. No, they were like a month. Like Adar Tafshin Lamed Tes. I'm guessing. Maybe I looked it up. I don't remember the details now. Maybe after it had been repealed, maybe there was talk again of trying it again, and therefore he reissued it. Whatever happened there, I don't know. But it's not. I'm not a chroi for. I'm not the one who has to look after Igros Moshe's accuracy and reputation. That's for other people to take care of. But it's just interesting to point out that I was able to confirm that this is actually from the winter of 1974, and in direct reaction to these events. I actually saw in a sefer from Rav Harpenis from Williamsburg, yisroel v'azmanim. He writes about this also, and he also mentioned, very few svarim mention this specific chapter explicitly. But in one of his volumes of yisroel v'azmanim, he does mention that there was a ma'aseh that they changed the clock in the winter, and whatever takanas he told his followers, whatever followers he has. And he's mitzayin to a bunch of Marmakaimis, not all of them dafka from Tafshel Lamed. Among other things, he's mitzayin to Kervitz L'Toida V'Hayra, which I think is his way of being mitzayin to Rav Moshe. He can't be mitzayin directly to Igros Moshe, because in Williamsburg that's controversial. So his way of being mitzayin to Rav Moshe is he apparently knows about the fact that it was printed first in this Kervitz. So he's mitzayin to the very obscure, L'Fiarach, I think it's an obscure Kervitz. He's mitzayin to the Kervitz, and this is in Tafshin Samach something. He's being mitzayin to the Kervitz, which I thought was mildly amusing. So in this tshuva, Rav Moshe is dealing with the questions within the Fruma world, and even in Brooklyn, even in Flatbush, even relatively yeshiva leaning world. There were those, there probably still are those that are very balabatish yidden, and they get up and they daven 6:30, and they're on their way to work by 7 something. So this totally throws things off. And the shaila is, how much further back can we move? So there's the shaila of Shema, the shaila of Shemoneh Esrei, the shaila of even the brachas of the Psukei de Zimra. There's the shaila of the bracha on the talis, the bracha on the tefillin. These are all slightly separate questions that could be discussed independently. And Rav Moshe discusses a number of them in this shuvah in his own original style. Part of the discussion is, can we stretch the definition of Mishiyakir? Maybe until now we had a more conservative Zman for Mishiyakir. Maybe we can stretch it and move it back a bit. What's the Zman for Alei Sashachar? Maybe we can stretch that a bit. Right? We know even in Chabad, in the Alter Rebbe Zmanim, whenever it's the get staying up all night, you go to the Chabad.org calendar and you click on additional Zmanim, all of a sudden you see that there's a very interesting range of Alei Sashachars, right? So Alei Sashachar, just like Tzeitzak Chavim, Deluma is the other end of the spectrum of time. Just like Tzeitzak Chavim is all over the place, just in terms of Goinim, Rabbeinu Tam, and different shittas. So even because it's not, the sun rising and the sun setting, nets and shkia, there's not much room for halachic trickery. The sun either is visible on the horizon or it's not visible on the horizon. So that's pretty set. But everything else, what happens before that and after that, there's a lot more room for svaras and shittas. So that was also part of the discussion of, can we stretch the Zman of Alois more, and where do these different parts of davening or the mitzvah of talis and film, where do they fit into these different Zmanim? So of course we don't have time to get into that, but Rav Moshe does talk about that there and gives his hadrachas as to what could be done. There are some articles that I dug up from.
To look it up. I'm going to look up the Rav Moshe and go through it myself.
Right. Okay. I don't think even if I had it in front of me, I don't know if I would go through the hadrachas step by step, especially just with the limited time we have right now. I found at the time that Agudas Yisrael had also issued a list of hadrachas. It could be interesting to compare it to the Torah of Rav Moshe to see if it's identical or not. But Agudas Yisrael had also issued a list of. They said, "Hayos, we're not lobbying against the law anymore. So instead, we have to educate the Jewish community as to what the seder should be." Again, I did post some of the stuff on my status, on my chat that's linked to the status. So if you're not already seeing those, following those, if you can track me down, happy to hook you up. So there's the discussion there on these various details. Another interesting source that I found is a sefer called B'Mechitzas Chacham Yisrael by Yid Talmid Chacham. His name is Rav Yisrael Taplin of Lakewood. I think I have a relative that's related to him now. I think there was a shidduch, a cousin of mine that married someone that maybe a cousin of mine married an uncle of his a few years ago. That now there's a shtickle mechatana shaft. But at any rate, he seems to be from I don't know what his exact age is, but maybe he's in his 70s. So back in the Tafshin Lameds, he was being done in some of these inyanim with the American gedolim at that time, So in Kitzis Chacham Yisrael, he records these different discussions in halacha that he had with these different gedolim on the fee topic, and there's a few chapters, simanim there, on Ales HaShachar and Mishiyaker, where he records his discussions with Rav Moshe Feinstein, with Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, with Rav Zev Gustman, and with Tovia Goldstein, I think are the notable names, American names that I saw there. And so, for example, I'll just share one nakuda of Shaklavataria that he has there, which is, so he writes, and he writes after every paragraph, Tevis Tav Shalom Adalit, Shvat Tav Shalom Adalit, other Tav Shalom Adalit, and other dates, either later Tav Shalom Adalit or Laman Hey, or from other years. So he never spells out why there are so many in these samanim on Aleis and Mishiyaker, why there are so many paragraphs from Tevis, Shvat, other Tav Shalom Adalit. To me, it's obvious that this was the reason, because everyone was talking about these gedalim, these hagdaras back then. For some reason, I don't know if it's an editorial decision or whatever, but failing to include what I would consider to be the basic historical background, which would make the conversations and discussions more interesting. So this is my contribution to identify that these pages in the Sefer are shayach to this historical parsha. I will conclude, I think, with one interesting nakuda that he discusses there. The shaila that he had, that he asked his gedolim was, can you say Psukkah de Zimra, which Psukkah de Zimra, of course, are bookended by Baruch She'amar at the beginning. Baruch She'amar is the bracha at the beginning of Psukkah de Zimra, and Yishtabach is the bracha at the end of Psukkah de Zimra. Then after that, you say Baruch Hu, and that's an introduction, that's announcing that now we're starting davening for real. I don't know how many people understand the exact gedarim and agdaris, but the real part of davening is Shema, Berachas Shema, and Shemoneh Esrei. And then there's a bunch of Haisafis at the beginning, and a bunch of Haisafis at the end, and each Haisafis has Haisafis to the Haisafis, but one of the biggest major Haisafis to davening is Psukkah de Zimra, which already goes back for sure to the Zman HaGoinim. I don't know if it's earlier. And Psukkah de Zimra has Baruch She'amar at the beginning, and Yishtabach at the end.
It's Yadua, the Baruch She'amar and Yishtabach is probably the most famous example, together with Anes and the Yoav Keach, of brachas that are not mentioned in Chazal, that in the Maisa, the whole klal yisroel does say.
Right. So the shaila is, so on the one hand it's Haisaf at the davening, on the other hand it's one of the most canonical Haisafis to davening, and the Ad Kadei Kach, you have these brachas at the beginning and the end. So it has to be taken seriously. It's not just not just something that you can play around with. So the shaila is, on the one hand, we speak about Vasikin, it's about the Shema at the Zman, and about the Shemoneh Esrei at the Zman. So in theory, it would be very geschmack if you could just put on Talis and Tefillin before all the Zmanim, and say Psukkah de Zimra before all the Zmanim, and then Mechaven that you'll say Kriya Shema at the earliest, whatever the earliest Zman is that you're allowed to time that Kriya Shema will be at that second, and so everything else can come before it. So the trial is, though, can you say Psukkah de Zimra with the brachas and make a bracha and Talis and Tefillin before Aleis HaShachar? So all these gedolim, he asked, all these American gedolim, I mean, they're Litvish American gedolim, he asked them, and Rav Moshe said, yeah, it's fine, and it was left at that, and Rav Gustman, Rav Kamenetsky, they're all saying it's fine. The problem is, here he goes and shows them that there's a Shari Tshuva in Ered HaChaim, I believe Simon Tov Samach Daled, that quotes a Maharil, and the Maharil is in Hilchos Sukkah, I think it said. The Zman of the Maharil, speaking to loop it back around to what we said about time at the beginning, and how time was totally different, perceived different, measured differently, and experienced differently. So the Zman of Maharil, they woke up one morning and they said, "Oh, it looks light outside. It's Staman Amud HaShachar," and they used to daven very early. So they I don't know what Zman exactly they thought it was, but they started davening, and they said the put on Talis and Tefillin, they said Psukkah de Zimra. And then they realized that it's all one big mistake. You have in Chazal also in Sechos Yuma. They thought they saw the moon. They thought they saw the moonlight. They thought it was the daylight. It seemed hard to understand the Metzius if you don't live, like we said, plugged into this reality.
I mean, the whole Metzius of Mishiyaker is said is a very technical shir. You could recognize him, but not so. You know him, you don't know him so well, and how well you know him, and how again, it's a type of shir that means nothing to us.
I think Rav Moshe in this tshuva, which is, it's like a lengthy tshuva with, it's not parts of it are very technical. I think in the tshuva, part of what Rav Moshe gets into is is there a geder of talis before Mishiyaker b'chlal? Is Mishiyaker, being able to see the difference between the lovin and the tchelis and the talis? It's not part of the, until then, it's a b'klanish kemitzvah. Maybe you're being nitzel from an avera of wearing dalat kanfis unsitzes, but you're not being mekayim a mitzvah, so mainly there's no bracha. That's part of the discussion there of what Mishiyaker.
I'm sorry if you. I really have to wrap up. But just finish off what you were saying about he showed them the Maril and Sukkah. That was.
Yeah. So the Maril. So it says they started davening, and it's the chapsich that they're totally off, and they had to sit around, and they sat around maybe in the shul, make it dramatic. They had to wait for an hour until the correct zman rolled around. So you'd have to go camping in Maine and New Hampshire in the middle of nowhere to really maybe understand and appreciate how that could happen today. But this is what happened. So Mardil took it so seriously that this was such a mixture that it's the next Erev Rosh Chodesh, which is a whole separate discussion, Erev Rosh Chodesh and the fasting, he made a tiny tzibur with vayachal and sluchas to bechaper for the oven of the talis and tefillin and the psukkah de zimra before the zman.
Wow.
So that's how the Shari Tshuva quotes it. I guess I didn't look, I'm just quoting from the, not even the secondary source, I'm quoting from Kli Shlishi, from the Sefer Mechitzas Chacham Yisrael. That's how he quotes it. He went and showed it to Rav Gustman. Rav Gustman said, okay, he showed it to Yaakov Kamenetsky. Yaakov Kamenetsky even had a raya from a Rashi, that he felt he had a raya from a Rashi in Brachas that seems to imply that Psukkah de Zimra are said before Zman Kriyas Shema. So first he dings up with him on the Rashi, and Yaakov Kamenetsky backed off on his pshat on the Rashi, and then he showed him the Maril, and then he backed off on the whole Zach. Until then, Yaakov Kamenetsky. It's also interesting to show you how the Litvish gedolim thought and operated. Maybe they're not Bucky in the Shari Tshuva, and they're just going off Gemara Rashi. You see this with Rav Moshe also. Rav Moshe was willing to put it on the record in his svarim. The other gedolim, it's more like a shmooze. You're schmoozing with them on the record, off the record. But this is the conversation that you have with them. And then in the footnote, Taplin points out though that the Yosef Oimetz from Germany, when he quotes the Maharil, he makes it sound like it was more, I think, the talis and tefillin rather than the psukkah de zimra. Like you could be medayik. What exactly what was the main issue, right? Let's say you don't. Rav Moshe in his tshuva talks about putting on talis and tefillin, mitzad keeping the tzura of davening, but making the bracha on the talis and tefillin after davening, because the davening nach is easier to do earlier than the talis and tefillin is, paradoxically. So maybe you can make the bracha later. So that's the shaila. Once you start splitting, once you end up in the situation you're an oinus, which Rav Moshe says they're anusim, is a din oinus alpi the Shulchan Aruch, even though it's not the traditional oinus, but it's an oinus. So once you start picking apart all the different elements of it, it's very interesting how you start realizing that maybe was Rav Maril bothered about the psukkah de zimra, or was he bothered about the talis and tefillin? There's still a shtickle svar if you want to be a very original paisik, like Rav Moshe style and the style of these gedolim. There's still a little margin to try to taina that maybe the issue wasn't the Baruch Shamar the Yishtabach the psukkah de zimra, but rather the talis and tefillin. Part of the shaila is the psukkah de zimra. Part of the discussion there is, if you say psukkah de zimra before the zman, does it have a din psukkah de zimra, or the stam zaks tehillim? So then maybe you could say the psukkah de zimra without the brachas also, or maybe you could do that. You could not say the brachas of Baruch Shamar. One of the eitzes he brings there is to maybe say psukkah de zimra and say Baruch Shamar and Yishtabach without the shemes, without the brachas, and then afterwards just say a quick Baruch Shamar Ashrei and Yishtabach as like your nachtas man. It's that way you can go straight into Birchas Kriyas Shema. So it's very interesting how you start deconstructing davening and all these issues that we just take, all these parts that we just take for granted as one big shtick, one big hemshech of the seder of davening that you do. And all of a sudden you start realizing how you can, if you're willing to do this because you feel that the people are anusim and you do care for this part of klal Yisrael, even if you don't care about the Shabbos part of klal Yisrael, you care about this part of klal Yisrael, how you can start picking apart this manim. So I thought that was interesting to share, and I guess we'll have to leave it at that for now. And I guess we'll stay tuned to see what actually happens with the law, and if there are updates, maybe we'll do a follow up if relevant.
All right. Shkoyach, and to be continued.
Yeah, shkoyach.